All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Is this on? Hear me all right? All right, good morning, everyone. We'll say, let us begin a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Again, a tremendous yeshkoch to Rav Mel Ram for dedicating and sponsoring the Mizonos this morning in honor of the shir, in honor of the daf, to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda, Dr. Paul Weinberg, parents, Moshe ben Avram. And Avram David, excuse me. We thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the Sherman Drushos this month in the Schus of Rafu Shlema for Shulamis Bas Susha. Adam and Yudip and Zev for dedicating the Shurim this month in the Schus of all of our tefillos being Neskabel. A week of learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, incarnation of the yard site of Ira's father, Melvin Grossman Melech ben Azriel, Zichron Levracha, and Avi Zeisman, incarnation of the yard site of his mother, Ziva Bas Avram, Zichron Levracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Tzadikei 95, and we are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on Tzadikei Amud Aleph. So some really interesting cases today. Here we go. Misha Yonasoi Beis Nashim. Man was married to two women. And what happened? Umachar es Sadeu. So I'll say, remember again, a word of introduction. We know, we've already established this multiple times over, that halacha l'maisa, when a man gets married, all of his property becomes encumbered to the ksuva. Now, the nature of a ksuva encumbrance is unlike any other encumbrance. There's nothing else like it. In other words, if I borrow $1,000 from Ruvain, okay, so there's an encumbrance against my land. Encumbrance against my land. But l'maisa, that encumbrance, that lien, does not devolve upon metaltal, immovable property. Ksuva is unique in that the ksuva encumbrance, it really encumbers anything and everything. Movable property, real property, anything the husband presently owns, and anything the husband will ever own. This actually is written into the ksuva itself, where the ksuva indicates, again, anything a husband currently owns, I'm talking about contemporarily, will own afilu min galima da'al kasboi. Maybe you remember that from your chasana. Afilu min galima da'al kasboi, even from the shirt on your back. That's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. It's literal. That is the nature of a ksuva lien. It devolves against everything, even the shirt on the back. So both say. So therefore, we have the following situation over here. Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. And what happens? Umachar es sadeu. Now, after they got married, Reuven sells a field. So we'll say, which means now he's selling a field that what? Has a lien against it. Machar es sadeu. The kasva rishon lelokeach dinu dvarim elni imach. And I both say, interestingly enough, in this case, wife number one, Rachel, writes to the purchaser, I have no claim against this field. So again, Reuven sells the field is encumbered. Who is it encumbered to? Both wives, right? Rachel and Leah. Rachel writes, essentially, Dinu Dvarim, which literally means, I have nothing to do with this field, which for our purposes means what? I'm releasing my lien against the field. Now, Rachel wrote that. Leah did not write that. Okay, so what's the halacha? So we'll say, so now let's play it forward. Let's assume, Reuven dies, and now there's not sufficient property in the estate to pay off the ksuvas. So what happens? Listen to this. Hashniya motzia mehalokeach. So now ultimately, again, now Leah, the second wife, never released her claim against the field. So Leah could extract the property from the purchaser to pay off her ksuva. Now we'll say, right, Rachel can't do it. Why can't Rachel do it? Because Rachel released her lien. Now we'll say, now watch this. Urishonim in Ashniya. But after Leah seizes the field from purchaser, Rachel can seize it from Leah. Now what's the pshat? So Rashi understands over here that halacha l'maisa, when Rachel releases her lien against the purchaser, she's not really lifting her lien. What she's essentially saying is, I'm not going to collect it from you, purchaser. Right? I'm making a pledge, I'm not collecting it from you. Do I have a claim against this land? Absolutely. But I'm not going to execute the claim against you. So therefore, watch this. This is such an incredible case. So therefore, when Reuven dies, there's not enough money in the estate to pay off the ksuva. Rachel can't collect it from purchaser because she forgave that claim. Leah can. Leah extracts it from purchaser, And now I will say, now what could happen? Rachel could extract it from Leah. Now, why could Rachel extract it from Leah? Because unlike the previous cases where all the Kesuvos of all the wives were dated the same date, this is a case where Rachel married Reuven before Leah did. Therefore, Rachel has an earlier Kesuva than Leah, and therefore Rachel has the ability to extract it ultimately from Leah. But we're not done. And I will say, now watch this. After Rachel extracts it from Leah, guess who comes back on the scene? Purchaser. Purchaser extracts it from Leah. Now, we must be talking about a case when Reuven sold the field. When Reuven sold the field, he sold it with achrayus. He sold it with a guarantee. And therefore, again, achrayus says that if for some reason, ultimately, again, the land is seized by someone else, so the either seller or the estate has the obligation to make the purchaser whole. So after Rachel seizes it from Leah, purchaser can then seize it back from Rachel. Now, what happens after that? The chozer is chalila. Now, both say, interesting, what happens after that? After purchaser seizes it back from Rachel, then what? Leah can seize it back from purchaser, right? Rachel can seize it back from Leah. Purchaser can seize it back from Rachel, and chozer chalila. This keeps on, never ends. Ad sheyaseh pshara beinehem. Until all of the parties involved come to some type of agreement. I'll tell you, so fascinating. So they have to figure out how to negotiate this, because essentially there's one field in play. There's one field in play. And the truth is, right, you have a purchaser who purchased it knowing that there was a lien from the second wife, right? First wife released her lien. So second wife could seize it from the purchaser, but then first wife, whose ksuva precedes the second, could seize it from the second. Creditor that could then come back to the first wife. You told me you would never seize the land satisfaction of the ksuva. And this keeps going round and round and round. So I'll just tell you, there's a profound statement. There's a profound meaning in that morning. There's like a million seats. There's like a million seats, by the way. Good. And so we can also, yeah. Okay, good. So I'll say, next time I'll stand. I'm sorry. Right? So I'll say, what's interesting about this is as follows. This statement is such an incredibly profound statement if you think about it, because look at the lashon over here. V'chozeres chalila ad sheyasu b'shara beineim. See, Rabbi say there are some dynamics in life which keep on perpetuating until the parties involved decide to come to some type of agreement. How often does this happen? Not with necessarily even just with money, but with, thank you. I'm sorry, I meant to move it before. Thank you. How many times does it happen in life with like relationships, right? Family dynamics, that there's strife, there's difficulty, there's discord that occurs, and it's a perpetuating cycle until when? Ad sheyasu pshara beinehem. Sometimes if you want to break the cycle, you have to be willing to go ahead and figure out how to work out a compromise between the parties involved. Such an incredibly profound yesod. It's not just over here, it's just in many family dynamics. I will say this same case could come up with the case of a creditor, and it could also come with the case of a woman who lent her husband money. So again, we'll see in the Gemara, we'll illustrate these particular cases. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, now I will say, remember how this case started. Right? So remember again, you have Reuven's married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven wanted to sell a field. It's an encumbered field, right? It has a lien against it from the wife's Kesuvos. So what happens? Rachel writes to the purchaser, Din udvarim einli b'nechasim zu. Right? I have nothing to do with this particular parcel of land. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. That type of formulation, why does it work? V'chichas v'lei, ma'avi. V'atanya, we learned, ha'omer lechaveru dinu dvarim einli al sadezu. If a person says to his friend, I have nothing to do with this field, ve'einli esek ba, and I'm not involved in it, v'yadai misulakes hemena, and my hand is removed from it, lo amar klum. Remember again, we had this not so long ago. You have Reuven and Shimon in a partnership, right? And Reuven wants to extract himself from the partnership. So he uses one of these lashonos. My hand is removed from it. I have nothing to do with it. We'll say these lashonos are meaningless. When you have a financial interest in something, there is a concrete way to be able to go ahead and remove yourself from that interest. saying I have nothing to do with it is not sufficient. So if a woman has a claim, right? So we'll say, in other words, a partner could say, I no longer want to be a party to this. I want to remove my partnership interest. I'm being mafkir, my ownership interest to you. But what we call a simple siluk, removal of yourself from something, does not go ahead and unwind your partnership interest. So over here, it's not a partnership interest, it's a lien. But it's the same idea. When the woman just says, I have nothing to do with this, that's not a proper lashon of extraction. So why does that release her claim on this land? To which the Gemara says, no, what are we dealing with over here? B'shekana miyada. Oh, I will say it's where the purchaser of the land made a kinyan with the woman, a kinyan chalipin. So I will say, now when he's making a kinyan, he's essentially acquiring her rights in this property as well. So this is not just where she's just simply saying, I have nothing to do with this property. She's literally doing a kinyan with the purchaser and thereby removing her rights from the property, or I should say, removing her lien from the property. I says, still, even if she made a kinyan with him, why should that matter? Listen to this. Tema nachas ruach asisi labayli. I will say this is fascinating. Why can't she come around and claim, you know what? I never meant to go ahead and remove my claim from this land. But Rachel, you said, Dinu dvarim eli b'nechasim. You made a claim. You even made a kinyan. She could claim that what? I was just trying to make my husband happy. Right? We all do this in marriage, things that we don't really mean, things that we don't really want to do for the sake of making a spouse happy. So in this case over here, she's claiming that halacha l'maisa, I said that I gave up my rights or my claim, my lien on this land, because I know it was important. My husband really wanted to sell the property. The purchaser wasn't going to purchase it if he knew that it was encumbered. So I said I gave up my lien, but what? I didn't really mean it. Which we'll say, if you think about it, it sounds strange. Well, why did you say it? We'll say, remember again, for a woman to give up a lien, a ksuva lien against property, is a very dramatic thing. Because that property, that lien, that is her financial security. So she says, listen, I felt bad. My husband wanted to sell the property. The guy wasn't going to purchase it if it was encumbered. So I said what I had to say to make my husband happy. But I didn't really mean it. Milotan, did we not learn? We also listen to this interesting case. Lakach min ha'ish v'chazar v'lakach min ha'isha mekcho batal. We also listen to this case. A person comes and purchases a parcel of land from a man, from Ruvain. Now, the purchaser realizes that the land is encumbered. So what does he do? He goes to Rachel. And he's, Rachel, I just want to make sure that you're okay with the sale of this property. Even if she says yes, mekcho batal. Now we'll say mekcho batal means the sale is void. Now, that's a very dramatic statement. If you look at Rashi says over here, this is talking about specific types of land. Quotes of the Gemara B'Seches Bava Basra. We don't have to get into this now. For our purposes, what do you see from here? Alma yechol lihi shetomar nachas ruach asisi labayli. We'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Lamaisa, a woman could say, even though I agreed to the sale, I didn't really. Nachas ruach asisi labayli. We'll say, by the way, this Gemara is teaching us one of the most important dynamics in marriage, which is sometimes what a spouse says is not what they mean. Not what they mean. And I will say, on a serious note, that in marriage, sometimes it's so important to be able to intuit. I know my wife, and by the way, this goes both ways, but I think it often happens more. I know what my wife is saying, but what does she mean? And this is the source of much a shalom bayis problem, right? Where again, but you said, this is what you said. I know that's what I said, but you should have known it. And there's something to it, I will say. There really is. That in a healthy, loving marriage, right, there's what is said and there's what is meant. Hopefully, most of the time they're the same thing, but often they're not. And again, this goes both ways. A spouse sometimes has to be able to intuit, read between the lines a little bit, what it is that my spouse is really trying to convey. So here, Rachel says, listen, you wanted to sell the land. What am I going to say? No. In other words, you want to. I don't want to stand in the way, but this is my ksuva. So I didn't really mean it. I did not really mean to release my... So I'll say, I just want to point out, it's amazing. It's only Sunday morning. 8:17, a few minutes into the week. And Mamish Baruch Hashem, two incredible dynamics already. Number one, in marriage, be able to intuit what is really meant, even though it might be different than what is said. And number two, how certain relationship dynamics continue to go in circles until ultimately the parties involved are willing to sit down and make a pshara. Incredible. So I'm Rav Chisda, lo kasha. So we'll say, so now we have a problem. Right? Because our Mishnah seems to indicate that when the wife says, when Rachel says, Dinu Dvarim, I have nothing to do with the property, that she's really releasing her lien on the property. The problem is the Gemara quoted these other cases where it seems to indicate that even if she says, I release my lien, she doesn't really release her lien. But she said it because she could claim Nachas Ruach Asisi Labaili. I was just trying to make my husband happy. I didn't really mean it. So what's going on? Do we take her at her word or don't take her at her word? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Zeir, Amar Chisda lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Ha Rabbi Meir, ha Rabbi Yehuda. They both say two different opinions. One is Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. Both say, listen to this. Here we go. Fascinating. Disanya, kasav l'rishon v'lo chasmalo l'sheni v'chasav. Both say, this is a great case. Listen to this. Another brisa. Now a third case, we will say. Ruvain, watch this. Ruvain the husband, has two parcels of land. Okay? He sells both parcels. When he sold to purchaser number one, lo chasmalo. Chasmal means Rachel did not forgive the lien on the land, right? L'sheni v'chasmalo. In the second sale, Rachel did forgive her lien, right? It's the same case. Remember, Rachel's ksuva lien applies to all of the properties in the estate. When Reuven sells off parcel number one, Rachel does not forgive the lien. On parcel number two, she does forgive the lien. So the Gemara says, Ibdaks. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? Ibdak Kesuvos Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says she's lost her ksuva. Now both say lost her ksuva means she's lost her lien. She's lost her lien on both properties. They both say Rabbi Meir's idea over here is that once she signals that she is willing to go ahead and forgive a lien on a property, we assume that what? She's willing to forgive her lien on all properties. Rashi says, Ibda Kesuvasa, im ein sham b'nei chorin shari arishon omer hinachti lecha makom ligvos yemenu. Now let's say, so let me just tell you this outside. So Meir says like this. When purchaser number one bought his property, right? And ultimately again, purchaser number one bought the property and she did not forgive the lien. He said, I was okay purchasing that property. Why? Because when I purchased the property, Reuven still owned what? Field number two. Field number two is a place from where Rachel could collect her ksuva. So essentially, purchaser number one felt like he was buying unencumbered property. Now, Rachel chose to go ahead and forgive her lien on parcel number two. Purchaser number one says, hey, that's not fair. I left you a place to collect your ksuva. Therefore, Rabbi Meir says, she can't collect either from purchaser number one or from purchaser number two. Purchaser number two, because she actively forgave the lien. Purchaser number one, because it's not fair. He could say, I effectively bought unencumbered property because you could go ahead and collect from field number two. Rabbi Yehuda says, Yicholi hishatomar nachas ruach asisi labayli atem malachem alai. And ultimately, Rabbi Yehuda says, look, I didn't really mean, or she could say, I didn't really mean to forgive the lien on field number two. I was just trying to make my husband happy. And we'll say here, the Brisa adds in an extra phrase, Atem malachem alai. What do you want from me? I'm just trying to be a good wife. I'm just trying to make my husband happy, right? And so I agreed to forgive the lien, but I did not really mean to forgive the lien. So I will say, so pretty amazing. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, therefore, halacha l'maisa, she could collect from property number two. So I will say, so therefore, two different things. So Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, you codified the Mishnah. Stam lo hacha Rabbi Meir. Our Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir. And therefore, again, I will say, and ultimately, again, v'sasam lahasam Rabbi Yehuda. And the Brisa ultimately, again, reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda. So I will say, so ultimately, again, what's fascinating about this is, so Rabbi Meir is, therefore, in our case, the Mishnah, where the wife actively goes ahead and forgives her right to the land, we assume that forgiveness is halachically valid. We do not subscribe to the concept of nachas ruach asisi labayli. She did it to make her husband happy, and therefore when she lifts the lien, she lifts the lien. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that no, she could actually make the claim, I did this in order to make my husband happy, and that's the view reflected in the Braisa. So the Gemara says as follows. Amar Papa has a different interpretation. He says, Bigrusha v'divrei hakol. Papa says, perhaps the Mishnah, our Mishnah, is talking about a case of a divorcee. So if you look at Rashi, Amar Papa is almost right across in Rashi. Masnisin keshai segrusha v'achar kach kas v'lo l'lokeach kain. The Mishnah is talking about a case ultimately again of a grusha. And after she got divorced, ultimately again she wrote this. Now remember, after a woman is divorced, if she releases her claim on a ksuva, she can't claim what? Nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. Why? Because we assume that a divorcee has absolutely no interest in doing something nice for her ex-husband. Right? So there, in other words, I'm not talking about that there's animosity necessarily, but again, nachas ruach asisi l'bayli is a dinner like shalom bayis. Right? My husband wanted to do something. I wanted to be a good and supportive wife, so I supported it, even though I don't really mean it. Don't really mean it. So Rav Papa says perhaps our Mishnah is talking about a case of a grusha, where everyone would agree that if a woman is divorced but hasn't yet collected her ksuva, and her husband wants to sell a parcel of land, and she actively lifts the lien from the parcel of land, that lifting of the lien is what? Absolutely legitimate. She can't claim nachas ruach asisi l'bayli because she's a divorcee. Okay. The Gemara says, Rav Ashi says, Kula Mary. Could be that everything reflects the Rabbi Meir. How so? Listen to this. So when does Rabbi Meir say that ultimately again she loses once she lifts the lien? We look at that as legitimate. In other words, she can't claim nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. When do we say that? The Amri law I'isa dinachas ruach avarata lekama ibaylach lemi'aved. See, I will say maybe Rabbi Meir. Remember again, Rabbi Meir was of the opinion that in the case of the Braisa, where Reuven was selling 2 parcels of land, right? To purchaser number 1, she did not release the lien. To purchaser number 2, she did release the lien. So what does Rabbi Meir say? Ultimately, ibda ksuvasa. She lost her ksuva. She can collect from purchaser number 1, because purchaser number 1 has the right to say what? I left you a place to collect from parcel number 2. You chose to forgive that lien. That's your problem. And she can't collect from purchaser number 2 because she lifted the lien. So I will say, perhaps in that case, Rabbi Meir says, she can't claim nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. Why not, Rabbi say? Because if she was really trying to make her husband happy, then what would she have done? Lifted the lien from both of them, right? So the Gemara says, "I'isa dinachas ruach avarata lekama ibaylach lemi'aved ava belokeach echad afil Rabbi Meir moda." So I will say, but it could be that in the case of where there's only one sale of land, one parcel, and she releases her claim, maybe Rabbi Meir would hold nachas ruach asisi l'bayli umasnisin dikasav leila acher. And our Mishnah's case ultimately again is where she's writing it to another purchaser. So if Rabbi say Allah Lamaisa, the Gemara suggests you could even set it up according to Rabbi Meir. Okay, so I'll say so. Here's what we have. A general machlokes. Our Mishnah tells us that Allah Lamaisa, when a woman forgives her lien, her ksuva lien on a property, that is an effective forgiveness. Now, I will say, just the Gemara now peppers in over here, there is an alternative school of thought. And the alternative school of thought is that she could claim, even after she forgave the property, she could claim, I didn't mean it. Nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. I was only trying to make my husband happy. Now there's a machlokes as to when you apply the concept of nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. So let's go back there. So Tran Hasim we learned, Ziburis. So what's the interesting case? In any situation, so let's say by the way, this is true with any creditor case, where halacha l'maisa, there are unencumbered properties. So let's say again, I borrow $10,000 from Reuven. Now it's time to pay up. So we'll say, so in the interim, I sold off a whole bunch of properties. As long as I still own some properties, that's where the creditor has to take payment from. Even if what? All I have in my possession is ziburis. So we'll say, so this is this is a very important halacha. The ability to claw back properties, sold properties, to satisfy a debt, whether it's a loan, whether it's a ksuva, only applies when the debtor doesn't own anything. But if the debtor owns something, even if it's inferior quality property, that is always where repayment comes from first. That's right. It's only if the debtor has nothing, then we could claw back other property, sold property. Say, Bailu, what about the following situation? Ishtaduf b'nei chori mahu, the literal mishibadi. Watch this case. Watch this case. And you can apply it to a silver to a debt. I borrowed $10,000 from Ruvain. Okay? So now I have to pay him back land. Let's say for argument's sake, so in the interim, after the loan, I sold off $10,000 worth of properties, but it happens to be I still own a parcel of land that is worth $10,000 as well. Beautiful. So therefore, when the loan comes due, if I don't have cash, that's where the lender is going to collect from. But here's the interesting question. What happens if halacha l'maisa, the field gets flooded? Field gets flooded. So I have a perfectly good field. It happened to be it was in Fort Myers, right? It was in Fort Myers, right? So I had a perfectly good field. Nebuch, now again, active, right? What are they called? An act of God, act of nature, right? Field becomes flooded. Now the field is worthless. Field is worthless. So in that case, halacha l'maisa, does the creditor have the ability to go back and claw back other properties? So we'll say, so does he have the ability? So we'll say, see here the shaila. So the shaila is, in this case, there was an unencumbered property to collect from. It was there. It was extant. Now it got ruined through an act of nature, right? Through an act of God. So we'll say, so does that give the credit? Now, so because there was an unencumbered property to collect from, now it's ruined. Does that give the creditor the ability to go back and take back sold properties to satisfy the debt? So let's analyze. So Tashma, Kasav L'Rishon V'lo Chas Malo. So we'll say, everyone's going to try to prove this from the case ultimately of the woman, right? To the case of the Kesuva. Right? So now Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven's selling off parcels of land. Kasav L'Rishon V'lo Chas Malo. So he sold a parcel of land to another party, and Rachel did not release the lien. L'sheni v'chas malo. Then he sells to another party, and Rachel does release the lien on the second parcel of land. So what's the halacha? Ibda ksuvas Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says she's lost her ksuva. So once again, what does it mean she lost her ksuva? She can't collect from parcel number one. Why not? Why not? Because he could claim, I left you another piece of property to collect from. That's not fair. I essentially bought unencumbered property. She can't collect from parcel number two. Why not? Why not? She released the lien. So she's lost. So Rabbi Meir says like this. Now, if you would think that in the case of the creditor, where I left one unencumbered property, one property in my possession, and then it became flooded. So if you would think that Allah now my creditor should be able to collect from encumbered properties, sold properties, Nehi, something more says, if you would think, going back to our case, that where the unsold property becomes flooded, now the creditor has the right to collect from sold properties. Nehi de ibdak suvasa misheni merishon miyatigbi. So we'll say the parallel case would be, in that case, then Rachel, even though she lost the ability to go ahead and collect the ksuva from purchaser number two, she should still be able to go ahead and collect ksuva from purchaser number one. Amra Nachman Yitzchak, my ibda misheni. So Rav Nachman says, in that case, by the ksuva, maybe it just means that she didn't lose the ksuva from the first guy, right? She could collect it from the first one, but she can't collect it from the second one. Rava says, here's the problem. State shuvas pedavar doesn't make sense for two reasons. Number one, chada the ibdul gamre mashma. Both say in that case of the ksuva, it sounds like, both again, remember, the case of ksuva that we're referring to over here is where Reuven, the husband, had two parcels of land. He sold them both. First one he sold, Rachel did not forgive her lien. Second one, she forgave her lien. Rabbi Meir says she cannot collect her ksuva from either of them. She can't collect from number one because he could claim I left you a place to purchase from number two. She can't collect from number two because she released the lien over there. So Rav Nachman Yitzchak says, no, maybe when it says she lost her ksuva, it means she lost the ability to collect it from number two, but she can't collect from number one. Rav says that doesn't make sense for two reasons. Number one, chada the ibdul gamre mashma. The notion of ibda, lost the ksuva, sounds like what? Lost it in totality. Va'od, Tanya, furthermore we learned, lava mina echad umachar nechasav l'shnayim. So I'll say this is an interesting case, right? I borrow money from Reuven, and then I have fields. I sold fields to two people. Umachar nechasav l'shnayim. The kasav balchov l'lokeach sheni, and I will say ultimately again the balchov, the creditor says to the second purchaser, din udvarim ein li imach. Right, I have no claim against your land that you bought. Ein lo alokeach rishon klum. He has no claim against the first purchaser either. Why? Because Rabbi say again, why? Similar to the Kesuvos case. Because Rabbi say in this case over here, the first purchaser can say to the creditor, "You can't come to me because when I purchased the land, I left for you another parcel to purchase from." In other words, we see this theme over and over. When I purchase property, right? When I purchase property from someone, whether Reuven owes money to someone or he has a Kesuva lien, I, as the purchaser, could say, I left property in the pot, right? I left property in your possession that was suitable to satisfy the debts. So therefore, you have really no right to come to me. To which the Gemara says, Hasam ihu da'afsid nafshe biyadayim. So Rabbi say, here's the difference. Here's the difference, I will say. So in these cases over here, when you choose to release a claim on someone, you are causing yourself a loss, right? As opposed to the flooded field, I will say, where there's an act of God which causes the loss. So that's a fundamental difference. In other words, when you actively release a lien against a property, and now suddenly again, the only other property that's there, so you're causing yourself that loss, as opposed to a field that becomes flooded. That is an act of God, and therefore, again, perhaps in that case, there is actual recourse. So the Gemara is just quoting over here. The Gemara is pointing out the cases are not really similar. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rav Yemer Rav Ashi. Rav Yemer said to Rav Ashi, Amud Beis. So v'ha meisim b'chol yom. But I will say, but one second, this happens all the time. Now, what happens all the time? So I will say, we're focused on a very specific case, which is, I borrowed $10,000 from Reuven. Okay, now in the course a year ago. Now in the course of that year, I own $20,000 worth of property. I sold off 10,000 of it, and I still have in my possession a field that is worth $10,000. Beautiful. So if I don't have $10,000 in cash, where is Reuven going to collect his money from? Where's he going to collect it from? From the field. Now what happens? The field becomes flooded. What's the shaila? The shaila is, does Reuven, the creditor, have the right to claw back some of those sold properties in satisfaction of his debt? That's the shaila. So the Gemara was saying, well, isn't this like the case of the Kesuva, right? What was the case of the Kesuva, right? Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven owns two fields, both encumbered to the Kesuva. Ultimately, what happens? So he sells the first field. Rachel doesn't say anything. Right? He sells the second field. Rachel forgives the debt, the lien on the second field. Reuven dies. Now what happens? Rachel comes to number one to collect the field. What can purchaser number one say to Rachel? What can he say to Rachel? Rachel, I left you a field to collect your debt from. You chose to forgive that lien. That's your problem. This is Rabbi Meir Shita. You have no right to come to me. So the Gemara wants to suggest, shouldn't it be the same case in the creditor as well? When the creditors went ahead and purchased their, right, now back to the loan case. I borrowed $20,000 from Reuven, right? I sold fields over the course of the year. So purchaser one, purchaser two. When they bought their fields, they knew that what? I still had a field that was worth $10,000 in my possession. So they were safe. Now it became flooded. Can't they say to Reuven, not my problem. We left behind the field. To which the Gemara says, one second, I will say this happens all of the time. Where ultimately, again, right, what happens all the time? That I have an unencumbered field in my possession. It gets flooded. And now in order to satisfy the debt, I send the creditor ultimately, again, to the people who bought fields from me. Dahu Gavra. The Mishkan le Pardes. Charbosa gave a perfect example of this. Dehu Gavra, the Mishkan le Pardes lechavre le'eser shnin. Charbosa said there was a case. Just to illustrate this case over here. Halacha l'maisa. Good. Fine. So here's the case. I borrowed $10,000 from Reuven. And what did I do? I had a great idea. I have a vineyard. I gave him my vineyard. I say, you could use the vineyard. Mashkin li pardeisa lechavre le'eser shnin. You could have my vineyard for 10 years. And the use of the vineyard for 10 years essentially is the repayment of the debt. Okay, good setup. Vikash lechamesh shnin. Only one problem. The vineyard dried up after 5 years. After 5 years. So v'asa kamei d'Rabbanan. They came before the Rabbanan. The kasule tirfa. And I will say, what did the Rabbanan do? The Rabbanan allowed Reuven, the creditor, to go ahead and collect sold properties. So I will say, this is exactly the same case. Drying up of the vineyard is the same case as what? Same case as what? Flooding of the field. Flooding of the field. To which the Gemara says, Hasam nami inhu dafsidu anafshayu. Maybe the vineyard case is different. Why? Maybe because, again, in this case, I created the lost. Right? In other words, who created the lost? In other words, we'll say that we make the assumption that when you buy a field, you do the title search. Right? So if Reuven is buying a field from me, right, Reuven is going to look at my portfolio of assets, right? And he's also going to see who I sold to. Or I should say differently. When people purchase property from me, they're going to be looking at what? Specifically, at least in the Gemara, what are they going to be looking at more than anything? Outstanding debts. That's what they're looking at, right? Why? Because those outstanding debts create a threat to their ongoing ownership of the property. Because if I default on anything, whether it's Kesuvo or loans, they run the risks of property seizures. So therefore, say, watch this. This is incredible. So now I borrowed $10,000 from Reuven. Right? So I gave him my vineyard for 10 years to go out and use. Now, in the meantime, after the debt, I also sold a whole bunch of other properties. So the Gemara says, those guys who bought other properties, they know, everyone knows, vineyards are fickle. Vineyards are fickle. So the fact that Reuven got the vineyard for 10 years, any other purchaser knows that what? There's a strong possibility that what? That vineyard is not going to last for 10 years. And therefore they run the risk, ultimately, again, of property seizures as well. So Hasanami inu hudaf sidu nafshayu, kevan diyada de pardeisa avid dikish lo iban lemizban. Shabbos says, so therefore, again, they know. Good. What's the halacha? Shabbos, here we go. V'hilchasa, ishtadif b'nei chari, tear from Mishabadi. Shabbos say, by the way, this is the halacha l'maisa. Shabbos say, so in this case, let's go back again, just to frame which case we're dealing with. So halacha l'maisa in the case we're dealing with, namely, again, one more time. I borrowed $10,000 from Reuven, right? $10,000 from Reuven. I have $20,000 of assets. I sold off $10,000 of real estate in different transactions. It leaves me with a $10,000 field. Good news, right? If I have cash, I'll pay back Reuven cash. If not, then what? He'll take the field, unencumbered field. Now what happens? Field gets flooded. Reuven comes back now for payment of his debt. I have no cash. I have no field. What's the halacha? Reuven could go ahead and seize properties that were sold after the time of his debt, right? After the time of his debt, ultimately in satisfaction of the debt. Now what's the chiddush in that? The chiddush is the other purchasers can't say to Reuven, you have no claim against us because at the time we sold you the property, we left in Silber's possession an unencumbered field. So they can't deflect payment by saying that it's true. They did leave in my possession unencumbered field, absolutely, and that was to be the source of repayment. But in the event that field no longer becomes suitable for repayment, Reuven has the ability to reclaim sold fields. We'll say that is the halacha l'maisa. Now again, I'll point out, let's finish up. This is a great case. I'm going to buy it. Nechasi lech v'acharayich leploni. Listen to this interesting case. A man says to Rachel, I'm giving you my property, but after you die, I want the property to go to so-and-so. We've seen it's an interesting type of gift. We've seen gifts like this in the Gemara, where essentially I want to give someone the right to use something during their lifetime, but after their lifetime, I want it to go to someone else. But again, the someone else does not follow the normal inheritance lines, right? So I'm saying, I say, Rachel, I want to give you this field. I want you to use it during your life. And then when you die, I want this field to go to Zvulun. Who's Zvulun? Not your problem, Rachel. Not your problem. But I want it to go to Zvulun. Okay. Now what happens? Now Rachel gets married. So Balo Kiachavi, the husband is considered to be a purchaser. Ve'in la'acharecha b'makom ba'al klum. So what's very interesting? The husband essentially disrupts the transference of that property. The husband is considered to be like a purchaser in his wife's assets, and therefore halacha l'maisa, he becomes the owner of the asset after she dies, and it no longer goes forward. It no longer, what's the word? It's not conveyed to Zvulun after Rachel's death. Very interesting. So Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Ki aitana desanya nechasi lech va'acharaich leploni. So again, I say to Rachel, I want my property to go to you, and after you die, I want it to go to Zvulun. So Yarad Harishon umachar. So if Rachel sells the property, what's the halacha? After Rachel dies, right, or even before Rachel dies, machar hashini motzi miyad alakuchos divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that halacha l'maisa Zvulun has the ability to go ahead and extract that property from anyone who Rachel sold it to. Rabbi Shimon says, no, aim l'sheni elamash shir rishon. This is fascinating. Rabbi Shimon says the way these type of gifts work is here's what I say, Rachel, I'm giving you this property, and when you die, I want it to go to Zvulun. Rabbi Shimon says the way we interpret that is like this: Rachel, I'm giving you this land, and when you die, whatever is left should go to Zvulun. And I will say, now whatever is left means what? Means what? Whatever is in your possession at the time of your death should go to Zvulun. Which means what? Which means what? If she either A, used it up, or B, sold it, halacha l'maisa, there's nothing left for Zvulun. So therefore, I will say, what we're saying over here is therefore, if she were to sell it during her lifetime, the Zvulun has nothing. So too, when a woman gets married, her husband becomes like a purchaser in her assets, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, when she dies, Zvulun gets nothing. Zvulun gets nothing because it's as if the property has been sold to the husband. Fascinating. Omi amar Abai hachi, did Abai really say this? Abai says, listen to this. Eizahu Rasha Arum. I will say, what is the definition of a cunning Rasha? By the way, it's bad enough to be a Rasha, right? To be a Rasha Arum, right? Mamish, like, okay. What's the definition of a Rasha Arum? Zehamasi Eitza Limkar Benechasim Krab Shem. This is someone who gives advice to someone to sell property like Rav Shimon Gamliel. In other words, I will say, this would be someone who goes over to Rachel and say, Rachel, you know what you can do. By the way, you know what you can do. I was learning Daf Yomi. I know what you can do. You could actually go and use the property for a while, and then when you're not feeling so well, you think the end is near, after you do tshuva, go ahead and, or maybe before you do tshuva, then do tshuva on this also, then go ahead and sell off the property, make a little bit of money, you could pocket the money, and Zvulun gets nothing. So the Gemara says that's the definition of a Rasha Arum. Also, I just point out, by the way, isn't it fascinating? I would have thought like a Rasha Arum is someone who eats chazer in the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, right? Like that's like, I say, what do you see from this? Sometimes, like the worst things are people who act underhandedly, right? And still have a smile on them. Like they're stabbing everyone in the back, right? But yet they're your friend. They're your friend. So, if you're going to sin, then be an honest sinner. Be an honest sinner, right? Own it, do it, then do it. I would say we know this, right? Because we've all had to interact. Again, I'm not encouraging it. No, I want to go on record, right? Sin is bad. Don't do it. But I want to point out, like sometimes what Chazal say is, the worst thing is to be a disingenuous person, to be the kind of person who is underhanded, right? Like I'm your friend, but I'll stab you in the back afterwards, right? Or I'll be nice to you, but I'll talk about you. But that's a Rasha Arum. Chazal said, be a genuine person, even if you're going to be a sinner. Be a genuine sinner. Because we'll say, at least if you're a genuine sinner, I know what's wrong. I'm honest. So who's the Rasha Arum? Someone who tells Rachel, by the way, Rachel, just want to tell you, just so you should know, if you want, I know Zvulun's supposed to get the property after you, but if you want to use it up as much as you can, then sell it. So benefit from the property, that's Rasha Arum. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, so therefore again, what are we doing? We're going to tell, so I gave Rachel the property. Now we're going to tell Rachel, go get married, so that this way again, your husband will acquire the property, and therefore Zvulun won't get anything after you. The Gemara says, do we tell her to get married? No. Nises ka'amar. It means if she did get married, in other words, we're not telling anyone what to do. We're making a de facto statement that halacha l'maisa, if a person went ahead and got this kind of gift and then got married, just understand her husband becomes a de facto purchaser of her estate, and that disrupts the flow of the estate to the, what's the word? Secondary beneficiary, to Zvulun in this case. From Rabbi, Abai says, similarly again, I say to Rachel, I'm giving you my property, and after you, I wanted to go to Zvulun, umachra, and she dies. Now, I'll say, in this case, Rachel got married, either was married or did get married, listen to this, and then she dies, habal motzi miyad halakuchos, the husband has the ability, she went out and she sold it during the course of the marriage, the husband has the ability to go and extract it from the purchasers. Listen to this. Va'acharayich miyad haba. Oh, now Zvulun comes along. So I'll say, now watch this case. I say to Rachel, I want you to have the property, and after you die, I want it to go to Zvulun. Rachel gets married. What happens when a woman gets married? What happens when a woman gets married? Right? Her husband becomes effectively a purchaser in her assets. And now what happens? So now she sells it. Rachel dies. Husband extracts it from the purchasers. Now what? I will say, now what? So Zvulun extracts it from the husband. Oh, all right. Zvulun extracts it from the husband. Now watch this when I finish. And what happens to both say? The purchaser extracts it from Zvulun. Now, why does the purchaser extract it from Zvulun? Because the purchaser, Rashi points out over here, bought it with achrayus, bought it with a guarantee from Rachel. Shabbos says, isn't this a great case? Watch this. So one more time. I give a gift to Rachel. I say, Rachel, this property is yours. And after you die, I want it to go to Zvulun. Rachel either is married or gets married, whatever it is, right? Her husband becomes a purchaser in her assets. Rachel sells it. After Rachel dies, husband extracts the property from the purchasers. Zvulun, who was gifted it to me, extracts it from husband, right? Zvulun extracts it from husband. And then what happens? We'll say, this keeps on going round and round. Husband extracts it back from Zvulun. Good. So the Gemara says, but at the end of the day, we go ahead and we settle the property in the hand of the purchaser. So he put it, in other words, in this case, right, the circle, by the way, the circle, of course, over here is husband extracts it from purchaser, Zvulun extracts it from husband, purchaser extracts it back from Zvulun, husband extracts it from purchaser, Zvulun extracts, right? That's the circle. Purchaser, husband, Zvulun, purchaser, husband, Zvulun. The Gemara says we stop the circle, and we establish the property in the hands of the purchaser. I says the Gemara, 1 second. Why is it different than the Mishnah? Remember again, we had a similar dynamic in the Mishnah. What was the similar dynamic in the Mishnah? Remember again the case of the Mishnah? Right? So Reuben was married to Rachel and Leah. What happened over here? So Reuben sells a piece of property. Rachel releases her lien from the property, Kesuva lien. Leah does not. Remember again what happened? Reuben died. There's one parcel of land. Remember again what happens? So Leah extracts it from purchaser. Rachel extracts it from Leah. Purchaser extracts it from Rachel, right? And this keeps on going around and around and around. So the Gemara says, yet in that case, what did the Mishnah say? The chozros chalila, the circle, we have to make a pshara. We have to make some type of compromise. So we'll say, in the case we just mentioned over here, the Gemara doesn't say anything about compromise. What does the Gemara say? We keep the property in the hands of the purchaser. So why in the case of the Mishnah do we make a compromise? And I will say, by the way, what does compromise mean? What does compromise mean? Everyone's going to get something. Right? In the case of the Mishnah, what it sounds like over here is that Rachel's going to get something, Leah's going to get something, and purchaser's going to get something. Yet over here in this case, we put everything with the purchaser. So why the distinction? Shabbos, listen to this. Very simple. Hasam islu pseida lekulu, hachalokechu dislu pseida. Shabbos, listen to this. In the case of the Mishnah, everyone has a loss. Shabbos, I can think about it. In the Mishnah's case, Rachel, Leah both have a loss. Why? Because this is the only way they're going to get their ksuva. Purchaser has a loss. Why? Because he paid money for the field. So when everyone is going to have a loss, that's when we try to make up shara. Rabbi say, in this case we just mentioned, remember again, in this case, I say to Rachel, the field is yours. When you die, what happens to it? What happens? Goes to Zvulun. She gets married, husband becomes a purchaser in her estate, in her property, she sells it. She dies. Husband extracts it from the purchaser, right? Husband extracts it from the purchaser. Then what? Zvulun extracts it from the husband. Purchaser extracts it from Zvulun. In that case, I will say, out of the three parties, husband, Zvulun, and purchaser, there's only one person who has a loss. Who's the one person who has a loss? Purchaser. So therefore, I will say, in this circular case, where there's only one person who has a loss, we're going to put the property in the possession of the person who has the loss, only the purchaser, because the purchaser is out money, right? Zvulun doesn't have a loss. Why? Because for Zvulun, what did this represent? What was it? It was a gift. Husband doesn't have a loss because, again, it was found property that his wife had. So neither of us, understand how we're defining loss. We're defining loss as who expended capital, right? As opposed to in the case of the Mishnah Rabbosai, there are three parties who have a loss. Rachel needs to collect her ksuva, right? Leah needs to collect her ksuva, and purchaser purchased the field. So when there's three people who have a loss, that's will make a pshara. One person who has a loss, keep the property with him. Also, Rav from Amr L'Shmai to Kamed Ravashi. So also Rav from Kim, and he said over this idea from Ravashi. He said, Miyamar Abai Haki, did Abai really say this? Vamar Abai said, Nechasti Lech Vacharayich Leploni. Right, if I go ahead and I say to Rachel, here's the field, and after you die, goes to Zvulun, Amda V'Niseis, and she goes out and she gets married. Rachel gets married. Baal Lokeh Achavi, Ve'in Lacharayich B'Makom Baal Klum. Right, we'll say ultimately again, the husband is a purchaser, right? And Zvulun has no rights in the property once there's a husband there. Amrle, here's the difference. Hasam de Amrle Kishi Pnuya, Hachad de Amrle Kishi Nisua. I will say it's two different cases. One is where I give the gift to Rachel when she's single, and one is where I give the gift to her when she's married. So what's the difference? My Amrle, Acharayach Likni, Balo Likni. The way we're setting up, Rabbi say, is that the case is where I say to Rachel, I want you to own this, but I don't want your husband to have any rights in it. So if you say that, you could give a woman a gift or give a woman something that her husband has no rights in. So if that's the way he said it, then enachinami, the husband would have no rights in the place of Zvulun. Masha'enkein, if I give to Rachel when she's a single girl, I give her when she's a single girl, and then ultimately, again, she gets married, the husband becomes like a purchaser in that, and therefore, Allah Lamaisa, again, he has the ability to extract it from anyone who she purchases it. He has the ability to extract it from anyone who she sells it to, and he would cut off the progression to Zvulun. So therefore, I will say, again, so I just want to point out two pieces of halacha lamaisa. So first of all, this idea, which is very important, that halacha lamaisa in general, the way we pass with a gift like this, if I give a gift to I give a gift to Rachel. I say, Rachel, after you die, right, I want it to go to Zvulun. The way that type of gift works is only what is left goes to Zvulun. And Einach Inami, if she were to go ahead and sell it, Zvulun would have nothing. Now that's not appropriate because obviously the intention of the grantor, right? My intention when I give it to Rachel is I want it to go to Zvulun, but Einach Inami, if she disrupts the chain, either by consuming the property in totality or by selling it, or for that matter, by getting married, that disrupts the chain. I will say furthermore again, the distinction over here in this case of where you have husband, purchaser, Zvulun, versus the three parties in the Mishnah, Rachel, Leah, purchaser. In the Mishnah, we'll make a pshara, everybody gets something. In the Brisa case, only the purchaser gets something. We only make pshara where everyone is owed something. But where there's only one party that's going to have a loss, we establish that property in the possession of the person who's going to suffer the loss. Incredible. Let's just finish up the parak. The Gemara says as follows. V'chein bal chov. Shabbos said the Mishnah said, the Gemara said the same halacha that applies in the Mishnah by the Ksuva also applies in the case of a debt. What's the case of the debt? Tana v'chein bal chov. The Gemara says ushnei lekuchos. The same applies in the case of a creditor with two purchasers. Shabbos said, take a quick look at Rashi. V'chein bal chov ushnei lekuchos. Ruvain noshet b'Shimon mana. Shabbos said, here's the case. Ruvain lent Shimon $1,000. Veloshte sados, and Shimon has two fields. Umachron l'shnayim, and he sold the field to two different parties. Zubechamishim. Okay, I should really lent him 100. Call it 100. Right? He sold one field for 50, a second field for 50. Because of Baal Kov Lokeach Sheni, and the creditor wrote to the second purchaser, Dinu Dvarim Eini Imach. I'm releasing my lien against your second property. Ultimately, the Baal Chov can only collect the debt from the first one. The Kan Elomar Henachti Makom Shetig Behemenu. So, I say, interestingly enough, in this case, the first creditor, the first purchaser, can't say to the creditor, I left you a second field to collect from. Why not? Because to begin with, the value of the loan was already larger than the value of any one field. So therefore, we'll say again, this was a case of where the loan is for 100, each field is worth 50. So by definition, the loan devolves upon both fields. Similarly, Rashi Gemara goes on, V'chein isha bal chov u'shnei lekuchos. The same would apply ultimately again in the case of a woman who is a balas chov. What's this case? Look at Rashi. Last Rashi in the paragraph. V'chein isha balas chov shaya lachov ksuvas sa'al baila. So Rabbi says, this is a woman ultimately again who has a claim of a ksuva against her husband, umachar shtei sados of the shnayim, and ultimately goes ahead and sells his 2 fields to 2 different people, and what? Ve'im b'shneim elakidei ksuvasa. And Rabbi say, let's say this is a case where halacha l'maisa, the value of both fields was equal to the ksuva. So Rabbi say, in this case, even if she went ahead and released the lien on one field, the second purchaser, the first purchaser, can't say, I left you a place to collect from. Why? Because since both fields were needed to satisfy the total of the ksuva, therefore, again, she has the ability to collect from the field whose lien she did not release. So I will say, let me just bring this all together for you, just because of time, just quickly. Right, let me bring it all together for you. So therefore, I will say, what comes out of this sugya is as follows. Halacha l'maisa, if a woman releases her lien from a property, then halacha l'maisa, that field is unencumbered. Right? So a woman has a right. She has a lien against the property. She has a right to go ahead and lift that lien from a particular piece of property. Now, I will say that interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, there may be an exception to that rule. What's the exception to the rule? When we are concerned that maybe she's claiming nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. If she comes along and she claims that I never meant to lift my lien, I never meant to lift it, but rather, again, I was just trying to make my husband happy, that claim potentially could work to reinstate her lien. Now, when could she claim nachas ruach asisi l'bayli? When does that? So that's a little bit more of a machlokes, ultimately, again, in the Gemara. But from our Mishnah, what seems to be clear is that halacha l'maisa, if she releases a lien, the lien is released. The lien is released. Now, according to the Mishnah, you come to a very interesting case where wife number 2 collects the property, and then wife number 1 can collect it from wife number 2. Purchaser can go back and collect it, and we have the circle. When there's a circle, right, when it's chozer chalila, then what? Pshara. But pshara only applies when? When all the parties involved stand to suffer a loss. But if you have one of these circular situations where only one party suffers a loss, then what? We establish the money in the possession of that party who suffers. So I will say, Hadran Allah, Mishai Nasui. I will say, Shkoyach, Mazel Tov, Mirat Hashem, B'Shal Tov, Mazachas, brand new parak for first day of Yom Tiv, Shkoyach. All right, Chevra, Jerry, a good Yom Tiv, beautiful, oh, what a backdrop. Greg, a good Yom Tiv, Eretz Yisrael, Chevra. I'm jealous. Hava Bizocha to join you one day. Maybe Chalamayid. Jerry, if I come, I'm staying by you. I'm just telling you. There's Hashem. A good time to everyone.